President Wilson arrived in Europe in January 1919 with the intention of applying his principles of peace based on the self-determination of peoples and the creation of a League of Nations. However, it soon encountered opposition from the Allied governments, especially Great Britain and France, which defended more specific interests after the end of the war in November 1918. The Paris Conference, held in 1919, brought together the winning powers to decide the future of Europe. It was not a negotiation on equality, but rather an imposition of conditions by the victors on the defeated countries. The fundamental decisions were made by the main Allied leaders, Wilson for the United States, Lloyd George for Great Britain, and Clemenceau for France. One of the main problems was the treatment of Germany. France, which had suffered enormous human and material losses, demanded security guarantees that implied permanently weakening Germany. Great Britain, although also interested in limiting German power, sought to maintain a certain balance to avoid an economic collapse in Europe. Wilson attempted to maintain a more moderate stance, but had to give in on numerous points. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed harsh conditions on Germany. He was forced to accept responsibility for the war, pay large financial reparations and reduce his army to 100,000 men. It also lost all its colonies and more than 13% of its territory, including regions such as Alsace and Lorraine, which returned to France. In addition, the demilitarization of the Rhine region was established as a security measure for France. Although different proposals were discussed, this solution was considered a compromise between French demands and the more moderate positions of other allies. Britain played a key role in moderating some of the most extreme conditions, but also defended its own interests, especially in the maritime and colonial spheres. Meanwhile, the United States, despite having promoted the idea of the League of Nations, would end up being left out of it. The decisions made in 1919 generated deep resentment in Germany. The population considered the treaty unfair and humiliating, which caused political instability in the following years. This unrest would become one of the factors that would mark the future of Europe. During the 1920s, Europe attempted to rebuild itself after the devastation of war. Some countries experienced some economic recovery, but this stability was fragile. Political tensions and economic problems persisted, especially in Germany, where inflation and unemployment aggravated the crisis. The League of Nations, created in 1919 as an instrument to maintain peace, failed to fully achieve its objective. The absence of the United States and the lack of effective mechanisms to enforce its decisions limited its ability to act. Post-war Europe, far from being a stabilized continent, was marked by an unstable balance. The decisions taken between 1919 and the following years did not resolve the underlying problems, but rather left open tensions that would eventually flare up again. When presenting the text of the Treaty of Versailles to the Senate after his return to the United States in July 1919, Wilson acknowledged that it contained inadequacies, but stated that these would be compensated for by the agreement that granted the United States the moral leadership of humanity. He ended his speech on an idealistic note. The stage is set, the destination is unknown. The hand of God has placed us on this path. We can't go back. We can only move forward, with our eyes high and our spirit alive. America is the light and guide of the way. However, the United States rejected Wilson's appeal. The Senate refused to give the two-thirds majority required to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. The American people, by electing Harding as their president in 1920, evidently endorsed his decision. The reorganization of Eastern Europe. The second great task of the Paris peacemakers, after the peace with Germany, was the recovery of Eastern Europe. The almost simultaneous defeat of the Russian, German and Austrian empires meant that the map of Eastern Europe, from Finland in the north to the Black Sea in the south, had to be redrawn. The recomposition was prepared by the Allies through 3 different treaties, with Austria in September 1919, with Bulgaria in November of the same year and with Hungary in June 1920. The Baltic states of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, former parts of the Russian Empire, gained their independence. Poland, which had been a great European power and which in the 18th century was dismembered by its neighbors, was established as an independent state. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was divided between half a dozen successor states, of which Austria and Hungary, previously the two power centers of the empire, were now the smallest. The guiding principle underlying the re-establishment of Eastern Europe was the idea of nationality. The borders between states had to coincide as much as possible with the borders between peoples. This principle was modified in practice by two other considerations. It was certainly inevitable that Germany's Eastern European allies, Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria, would be treated less equitably than their neighbors, but it was difficult to justify both the annexation of Austrian South Tyrol by Italy and the inclusion of large Magyar minorities in the territory of Hungary's neighbors. The second factor that limited the application of the principle of nationality was the fear of revolution. The Big Three agreed on the need for Russia's neighbors to be as strong as possible, in order to strengthen their ability to resist the advance of communism to the West. No Bolshevik could have imagined that the Russian Revolution would remain isolated in Europe. In early 1919, Zinoviev, leader of the Communist International, prophesied that within a year all of Europe would be communist. Today it is easy to assess the error of such a prediction, but at that time it was taken seriously. Bolshevism, Wilson wrote, is moving steadily westward. It has reached Poland and is poisoning Germany. Many other statesmen at the Paris Conference feared that the foundations of European society would collapse. Lloyd George wrote in March, Europe is imbued with the spirit of revolution. The prevailing order, in its political, social and economic aspects, is questioned by the masses from one end of Europe to the other. Fear of the spread of Bolshevism was reinforced when a communist regime, led by Bela Kun, took power in Hungary for a few months in the spring and summer of 1919. Although an attempted communist uprising in Berlin had been bloodily suppressed in early 1919, European statesmen saw a danger in the fact that Germany could follow Hungary's path and drag all of Central and Western Europe into communism. This fear remained in the minds of the peacemakers during the negotiations of 1919. Secret offices were set up in the New Scotland Yard and the U.S. State Department to cut off communist progress, which was spreading across Europe. The Civil War in Russia. While Allied statesmen assessed the communist threat at the Paris Conference, Russia was going through a period of internal chaos. The Civil War had broken out. The Bolsheviks were challenged by white armies, which attacked them from Siberia, the Gulf of Finland and the Caucasus. If the Bolsheviks survived this combined action, it was due in part to the skill with which Trotsky led the Red Army, although he was unexpectedly helped by the faction of the enemy. Gradually, the white armies fell under the control of men belonging to the old and discredited ruling class, hostile not only to Bolshevism, but also to liberalism. Among the Russian peasant masses, on whom the outcome of the war ultimately depended, the conviction grew that the Bolsheviks were fighting for the people of Russia against the white generals, whose only political and social program was reaction and the restoration of ancient aristocratic privileges. The Russian Civil War offered Western governments the opportunity to change the Russian revolutionary direction. 2 or 3 Allied divisions landed in the Gulf of Finland in 1919, probably could have easily forced their way to Moscow, the new capital of Russia, and overthrew the communist regime. But after the First World War there was no strength or will for it. In none of the Allied countries was public opinion willing to tolerate intervention on more than a purely symbolic level. The troops sent served mainly to further discredit the white cause. They were too few to affect the outcome of the war, but enough to allow the communists to point out their opponents as instruments of Western imperialism. In early 1920 the white forces, although not definitively defeated, did not appear to constitute a serious threat to the Bolshevik regime. In April, the civil war in Russia was overshadowed by the start of the war with Poland. The Poles invaded Russia, nominally in support of Ukrainian nationalists, but with the true intention of conquering Ukraine for Poland. The Polish invasion of Russia morphed into the Russian invasion of Poland, followed by the creation of a provisional government of Polish communists. For a few months in the summer of 1920, many Bolsheviks believed that they were engaged in the construction of a Soviet Poland, which would push the frontiers of Bolshevism to the borders of Germany and allow the German communists, with the help of Russia, to gain power. Churchill, among others, feared that they might succeed. In July 1920 he published an article in the Evening News with a sensational title, "The Danger from the East." In it he suggested to the Germans that, before it was too late, they build a dam of strength against the wave of red barbarism flowing from the East. If they did so, he assured them, they would once again take their place in the great assembly of Christendom. In August 1920 the Russian advance was stopped. The Poles, with French assistance, inflicted a decisive defeat on the Red Army at the Battle of Warsaw, and began a triumphant counteroffensive that brought them to the Russian borders. In March 1921 the Russians were forced, by the Treaty of Riga, to leave 6 million Ukrainians and White Russians under Polish power. The failure of the Red Army in Poland ended hopes of a revolution throughout Europe. Only after the next European war would Bolshevism be able to resume its expansionist expectations in Europe. After 1945 he succeeded where he had failed in 1918, due less to his ideological power than to his far superior military strength. However, in the interwar period, the most serious threat to liberal democracy in Europe came not from Soviet communism, but from fascism, which emerged more rapidly in Italy, and more slowly, although more virulently, in Germany. The initial impetus of fascism in Italy was due to the panic produced by the revolutionary phenomenon. The Nazis tried to exploit the same fear in Germany. "My ambition," said Adolf Hitler, after his first unsuccessful attempt to gain power in 1923, "is to destroy Marxism. And I will fulfill this task." The Weimar Republic. On August 14, 1919, Germany became a democracy. The first article of the Weimar Constitution, named after the city where it was drafted, proclaimed, "The German Reich is a republic." Political legitimacy comes from the people. Its drafters tried to combine in it the best aspects of the British Bill of Rights, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the first 10 amendments to the American Constitution. All of his articles, except one, were a model of democracy. The exception was Article 48, which allowed the president, who under normal circumstances was moderate, but did not govern, to confer absolute power on the chancellor if public order and security are seriously disturbed. 3 chancellors, during the final years of the Weimar Republic, assumed absolute powers. The last was Adolf Hitler. The Weimar Republic was aptly described by its first chancellor as a candle burning at both ends. The German right, which propagated the myth that politicians, not generals, were responsible for the capitulation of 1918, considered the new republic a humiliation imposed on Germany. The republic received little loyalty from its supporters, but for 13 years the number of citizens who supported it exceeded their opponents. However, in July and November 1932, in the last free elections held in United Germany, the enemies of parliamentary democracy were in the majority. During the first 4 years of its existence, the Weimar Republic was in a permanent state of economic and political crisis. Post-war inflation, which affected all European states, hit Germany harder than anyone else. War reparations provided a convenient excuse for their economic woes. The real cause, however, was the financial irresponsibility of their governments. In Britain, during the war, income tax had reached the unprecedented rate of 5 shillings to the pound. In Germany, by contrast, not a single mark of war production was financed by taxes. The government resorted, instead, to large internal credits and the issuance of paper money. After the war, the same policy was continued. In these 4 years, the government spent 4 times more than it received in taxes, and the German mark continued a rapid decline. In 1923 it was literally worth less than the paper it was printed on. In November 1923, at its lowest point, the mark was trading at 4.2 billion to the dollar. Consequently, the speed of Germany's financial recovery was the result of the financial irresponsibility of the last 4 years. That irresponsibility endangered not only the future of the mark, but the future of German democracy. By suppressing the savings of the middle classes, he destroyed their confidence in democracy and caused the collapse of the Weimar Republic. The financial collapse was accompanied by intense political violence. The leading figures in this wave of violence were the Freikorps, groups of volunteer officers who gained tragic celebrity through their bloody suppression of radical socialist movements in 1919. In March 1920, 5,000 Freikorps men led by Wolfgang Kapp, a former civil servant, occupied Berlin, dismissed the government, and revoked the Weimar Constitution. The Reichswehr, the German army, refused to intervene. General von Seecke refused the government's request in this regard, with a forceful response: the Reichswehr cannot be allowed to fight against the Reichswehr. It was the people of Berlin who, paralyzing the capital through a general strike, forced Kapp and his men to leave the city. Those who had taken part in the Kapp coup either fled without punishment or were amnestied. Seecke, who had refused to dismantle the uprising, was appointed head of the Reichswehr almost at the same time that the attempt failed. When the Ruhr workers called for a purge of the Reichswehr, General von Seecke branded them Bolsheviks and sent the same Freikorps that had tried to overthrow the government against them. For 3 years after Kapp's coup, the Freikorps took the lead in a well-organized campaign of right-wing political terrorism. In 1921 they arranged the assassination of Finance Minister Matthias Erzberger, the man who had signed the armistice on behalf of Germany. Erzberger, said a right-wing newspaper, has suffered the fate that the vast majority of German patriots wished for him. 1 year later, it was the turn of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Walter Rathenau, assassinated in part for his lax attitude towards war reparations, but above all for his Jewish origin. Several months before his death, nationalists were singing in the beer halls of Germany a tune that ended like this: "Eliminate Walter Rathenau, the damned pig, the son of a Jewish sow." The most disturbing aspect of these murders was their great echo among large sectors of the German people. The courts assumed as a common fact that the violence of the right, as opposed to that of the left, had reasons worthy of praise, and they were lenient in their treatment. The violence of the post-war years, along with spiraling inflation, reached its climax in 1923. The year began with the French occupation of the Ruhr, an action whose purpose was to enforce payment of the reparations that were owed. For more than 8 months, until the German government ordered its interruption, the population of the Ruhr organized a campaign of passive, and occasionally violent, resistance. Following orders from Moscow, communist uprisings occurred during the month of October in Hamburg, Saxony, and Thuringia. All of them were quickly repressed by the Reichswehr. The violence of the left was followed, as always, by that of the right. In November there was a right-wing coup in Bavaria, an imitation of Kapp's earlier coup in Berlin. As the right-wingers moved towards the center of Munich, the police opened fire and the coup failed. Leading this uprising were 2 of the most prominent dictators the 20th century has known: General Ludendorff, whose career was perishing, and Adolf Hitler, who was beginning his. Fascism in Italy. Italy, as Bismarck had long ago observed, was endowed with a voracious territorial appetite, but its teeth were inadequate. His gains at Versailles, South Tyrol, Trieste, islands in the Aegean and the Adriatic were an exaggerated reward for his small contribution to the Allied victory.
But the Italian government wanted more.
In particular, he intended the Dalmatian coast. In September 1919, the nationalist poet Gabriele D'Annunzio marched towards the Dalmatian port of Fiume at the head of 1,000 followers. To the bewilderment of the Italian government, which shared his ambitions but rejected his methods, D'Annunzio proclaimed the annexation of Fiume to Italy. For a year, until the Italian government managed to evict him, he led an operetta regime. His followers wore black shirts, greeted each other with outstretched arms in the manner of the Roman salute, and conversed with their leader at open-air meetings. But the nationalist hysteria reflected by D'Annunzio's adventure was not, as is often assumed, shared by the Italian people. The general elections of November 1919, unlike the post-war elections in France and Great Britain, were a failure not only for nationalists and conservatives, but for all those political groups that had favored intervention in the war. The newly founded Fascist Party, the most extreme of the nationalist groups, did not win a single seat. Its leader, Benito Mussolini, who appeared in Milan, obtained only 2% of the votes.
Until 1921, Italian socialists and communists coexisted in a single socialist party, united in their admiration for the Russian Revolution. In the 1919 elections, the Socialist Party won a third of the votes and tripled its pre-war parliamentary representation. The socialist newspaper Avanti declared triumphantly, "Revolutionary Italy is born." The wave of social unrest that flooded Italy during the years 1919 and 1920 seemed to prove right. Thousands of peasants settled on the large estates and took over their property. The government was powerless to prevent it. The industrial crisis reached its peak in August 1920, when 500,000 workers occupied the factories and raised the red flag there. Since the end of the war, the Socialist Party had openly demanded again and again the violent overthrow of bourgeois society. Lenin had used the occupation of the factories as a springboard for the revolution, but the Italian socialists lacked Lenin's vigor and clarity, and were unable to materialize their political power. In September, the factories were returned to their owners, in exchange for increased wages and improved working conditions. The final result of the post-war revolutionary process was not socialism, but fascism, that is, the counter-revolution. As the anarchist Enrico Malatesta prophetically observed during the occupation of the factories, if we do not go to the end, we will have to pay with blood and tears for the fear caused to the bourgeoisie. With the return of the factories to their owners, the real danger of revolution had passed. Italian Bolshevism, Mussolini wrote privately, is mortally wounded. But the Italian bourgeoisie remained convinced that Bolshevism was preparing for the final assault. By exploiting this fear, and presenting themselves as the saviors of Italy against the Red Revolution, the fascists rose from obscurity to a political position that gave them the possibility of gaining power. In July 1920, on the eve of the occupation of the factories, there were at most 100 fascist cells. 6 months later, the fascists had the unrestricted support of rural owners and the middle classes, who feared the advance of socialism. Fascist shock groups, known as squads, organized systematic attacks against unions, cooperatives, and socialist headquarters. The authorities, in many cases, tolerated or even supported these actions, seeing them as a break on communism. In October 1922, Mussolini and his followers organized the March on Rome. Faced with pressure and the threat of civil war, King Victor Emmanuel III refused to sign the state of siege and commissioned Mussolini to form a government. Thus began the transformation of Italy into a fascist state. Over the next few years, Mussolini consolidated his power by eliminating his opponents, restricting political freedoms, and establishing an authoritarian regime that would serve as a model for other fascist movements in Europe. Whatever their attitude toward Mussolini, almost all European observers of the 1920s were wrong about the meaning of the fascist movement. They considered fascism not as the beginning of a European movement,
but as a peculiarly Italian response to a peculiarly Italian situation. Mussolini himself endorsed his judgment. Fascism, he declared in 1928, is not an export item. Only the Nazis understood the European significance of the fascist counter-revolution. The March on Rome, Goebbels later wrote, was a warning, a storm signal for liberal democracy. It was the first attempt to destroy the world of the liberal and democratic spirit.